Good day. We're happy today to have with us Natalie Hahn. Dr. Hahn is the 2007 College of Education and Human Science Distinguished Alumni. We're very pleased to have you with us.
Thank you so much.
We have had the great pleasure the last few years of interviewing our distinguished alumni because they bring so much to us and they've done so much, and you're certainly another person with exceptional talents and things that we would like to hear about. First, why don't we have you begin by talking a little bit about your background, some of the things that you've done, starting with your early years in Nebraska and then your work with the United Nations and throughout the world.
Thank you. Well, let me just start by saying what a thrill it is to be back. You know, it's been 40 years since I was graduated, and when I was graduated, it was a College of Home Economics. And as I reflect back, I think, number one, how absolutely fortunate I am that I'm a Nebraskan, that I chose the degree that I did, and I had a double major in home economics and journalism. And one always says, well, how did the jump take place between being a Nebraskan and then being international? Because for 29 years of my life, I lived abroad. I lived in Italy. I lived in many African countries for 14 years, and I traveled and worked in 32 countries. And there's a couple of key factors. I mean, number one was my mother's influence. My mother was a journalist. She had a huge map at our breakfast table, and if there was news and events someday in China or in South Africa, you better know where those countries were. And she was a great promoter of traveling internationally, and every summer we would always go to Mexico. We traveled in all 50 states. We traveled to Europe because she felt that you had to be also not only a really great Nebraskan and American, but you had to be international. The second major influence was that I was fortunate enough to be a great member of 4-H with a lot of activities and the county fairs and attaining to get the purple ribbon and the speech contests. And I went abroad under a 4-H program called the International Farm Youth Exchange, IFE. Well, that was it. I suddenly became international and thinking internationally because I had the good fortune of being an IFE to New Zealand. And then I traveled on a Rotary Fellowship to India. And with that, with both Rotary and 4-H, then you're obligated to come back to Nebraska and to tell about your experiences. And for a long time, I thought I wanted to work in a U.S. embassy. So I started going through the Foreign Service exams, and I passed the first round. And then I felt I really wanted to work with the United Nations. I met many Americans abroad, and they were always very interesting persons and working in the embassy, but I thought working with the United Nations really would be my dream. And then so following that international 4-H program, then I went back and did a master's degree. And again, I think the other factors were that I had two wonderful deans when I was at University of Nebraska. Virginia Trotter was the Dean of Home Economics, and Bill Hall was the Dean of the College of Journalism, which was then a school. Both of these deans were very international. And when I came back after being an IFE, they both said to me, you really must do a master's degree. So I followed Bill Hall to Columbus, Ohio. And then after that, I was fortunate enough to be recruited by the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, the FAO, and then I moved to Rome. So it was very much family, 4-H, and farm in terms of bridging that between being a girl from Polk, Nebraska, which then had a population of 500, to now being international.
That's an amazing journey. And we were talking earlier about the fact that we need to encourage young people, especially people in high school and of college age now, to travel internationally and to become connected internationally. You agree with that?
Absolutely. I think the key thing is for a young person to study to travel abroad. And it can be with one's parents, it can be with another friend, it may be at an early age connecting with another school and having a twin schooling. Maybe it's a fundraising project. There's a wonderful group now called Shoe for Africa. And Shoe for Africa is a group that encourages American kids to have fundraising events so they can send new shoes to Africa and train women athletes. Because so oftentimes women are not involved or have any athletic program. So there's a lot of ways that kids at a very early age can be connected to global issues, but to also involve them in the philanthropic side of giving. So I think that early childhood education, it can start very, very young, encouragement of a second language, Lincoln, Nebraska have become so international with a very new demographic. drawing on the positive aspects of our new immigrants, the Russians, the Laotians, the Sudanese that now live in our state, but most importantly to travel abroad, to have that experience of being welcomed and living with a family in another country.
Very important. I know you have a lot of titles, but one of your titles is Tribal Chief. Yes. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, that's one of the nicest honors. I think that stands up with a Harvard degree, if not better. I worked a lot on soybeans, and it was a new crop in Nigeria where I worked for 5 years, and I was the scientist in an international agricultural research center called the Institute for International Tropical Agriculture. And we worked on 13 different food crops. But when I arrived there, I found out that none of the agronomists, who are all very well trained, ever tested their crops with women, who are the farmers. And secondly, that their criteria for success and their agronomic trials didn't include the nutritional value of the crops. So my job, which was probably the best time of all of my years abroad, was to take the new improved varieties, and in the case of soybeans, a new crop to the farm women. And of course, the farm women had a different criteria than many of the agronomists. They said, well, we can't afford the fertilizer, we can't afford this insecticide, the tubers don't cook very well, the cassava, doesn't taste very well. So a whole different criteria of what is success in agricultural research. So then I had the tough job of bringing all of these reports back to the agronomists, but it changed a lot of the way we did our research in terms of really looking at the household and particularly women's role in growing the crops and processing and the nutritional value. But the big breakthrough really came with soybeans. Soybeans was an entirely new crop. We would work in the hospitals and we would teach the women not only how to grow the crop, but how to process it. And the kids that were really malnourished, that were first born, we would teach them how on a 30-minute cycle, 24 hours, we would give them a diluted soy milk. And it would virtually save children's lives. There's a high lactose capability for many Africans and African Americans. And then the women, once they had the crop, soon found that there were a lot of other ways that they could use it. They would mix it with a little pepe, with a little pepper. They would sell it, as a roasted soybean. They would mix it with another group called dadawa, which was an indigenous tree nut, and it would make an exciting new product. So the women took it way beyond our own research. So based on that, one day a group of elders, the chiefs, came to me. I thought, my goodness, why are they coming to see me? And after a long discussion, they said that they would like to make me a chief. I said, well, this is wonderful. This is fantastic. They said, no, not so quick. It's going to take a year before you're installed because we have to watch what you're doing. So I said, okay, that's fine. And at that time I was working with home economists throughout Nigeria from what was then the 19 different states. And that's when the soybeans really started picking up. And you could see this tremendous transformation nutritionally, the different crops, the change of crops from usually a maize, what we would call corn, with soybeans, cassava, yam, mixing with bananas, mixing with different fruits. So the title that they gave me finally after that year, which they didn't announce until the day of the installation, it's a really wonderful title. It's called Belungani Yalaje, and it means the woman who transfers economic empowerment.
I read that. I thought it was
So it's
terrific.
just a great thing, and we call the program The African Farmer and Her Husband. And then my local name was Shade, which means Folashade. And the chiefs would always say, you're really African. The missionaries must have brought you in the 1850s. And I would say, but Chief, I have a white skin. They said, no, Shade, you have a black soul.
Ah, what a compliment.
Very sweet,
Yes.
very nice. So I had wonderful days in Africa, but the soybean experience was really one of the real highlights.
And so did it take the full year?
Well, it took the full year of watching. The celebration itself was a week long.
Wow.
We killed a lot of cows. It was 3,000 for a dinner, and you danced all night, and you had to have, I think I had 8 different outfits. And the women would do something really wonderful. The women that I'd been working with on all of these new crops improvement, all would buy the same material to have a dress made up. So for your event, it was like you had your own little fan club, of all the women, and they would come out and they would sing in your honor. And it was a wonderful, wonderful experience. I felt so honored.
I would say you should have. You've mentioned your travels. You've lived in 32 different countries, or traveled in 32 different countries. As you travel through the world and observe what you've observed, what are the hopeful signs that you see out there about us coming together?
I see so many hopeful experiences. I see women entering politics. I see an apartheid that ended in a terrible South Africa where even when I was with the United Nations, because I was with the UN, I was not allowed to leave the airport, where if you happened to be black, you were watched, you were guarded, you have to walk around South Africa with a pass. All of that has ended. I see new democratic states like Malawi, who after 34 years never had an opportunity to ever vote. A whole democratic transformation. I see kids entering school in Afghanistan, particularly young girls. And I see a private sector that is booming. You know, 10 years ago, there was 6 times more international development aid than private sector. Now that's reversed. There's 6 to 10 times more private transfer of private assistance than development aid. You see the factors of remittances going back home. Last year, we figured that at least $200 billion went back from America to home countries. So when you go to places like Ghana, Bangalore, it's not because there's development aid, it's because people are investing in their own countries. Last year, $1 billion was sent by Somalians living in America back to Somalia. And this is the way I think development should work. It's not about development aid or people from the West giving. It's saying, how can you build up the confidence of the private sector supporting their own country, supporting their own communities? So I'm very, very hopeful because I've seen so many experiences of things that have made such an impact and such a difference over the 35 years that I've worked in the UN. Are there still problems? Absolutely. Will there continue to be problems? Yes. But I see this tremendous transformation taking place on areas like women's advancement, microcredit possibilities, leadership. The computer and the internet is adding also to an international, global, technological improved understanding.
Now, I'm really glad we asked that question because that is proof enough that we need to get our teachers and our students and our administrators out across the world, if nothing more than to observe and bring back the hopeful message that you've just talked about. You have a foundation that you started recently, the Malaika Foundation. Could you tell us a little bit about it and its work?
Be very happy to. Malaika means my angel in Swahili. It's the language of Eastern Africa, mostly spoken in Kenya. And the purpose of Malaika is really to add an international dimension to Nebraska schools. So twice a year we have a symposium where we bring in teachers. We talk about international learning. We'll focus on the geography, we'll focus on cultures, we'll focus on human rights, but more importantly, we'll also give them the resources of how they can make a difference within their own school systems. We'll also try to balance that with bringing out the more positive aspects of our new immigrants that are within the state. And how do we balance? It's no longer that Nebraska's not international. We're very international.
Very much so.
So we're trying to draw on the strengths of these new immigrant groups, but also giving teachers that possibility of really having international educational approaches. We also take the best of the teachers abroad during the summer, and with the generosity of Kenneth Morrison from Hastings, teachers will go abroad for 3 to 4 weeks. And that can be a life-changing experience for many of the Nebraska teachers. I have a wonderful board that advise me on the directions and the mission of Malaika, and it's time for me to give back to Nebraska. And I think it's also my mother's memory who always would say to me, well, honey, it's great you're in Africa, but what are you doing for Nebraska? So it's also very much memory to her and to my own parents of how international I was and how privileged I was and what I can bring with my international experiences back to my home state and to my university.
Well, and it's exciting and it's also inspirational because we talked at lunch about famous Nebraskans and Nebraskans who make a difference. You would be in my book as one of those people because you've made a tremendous difference in the lives of women and children and others across the world.
That's very kind of you.
If we had students who dreamed of studying abroad, living abroad, making some kind of difference abroad, but also having this exchange we talked about, what advice would you give them? let's say they were just entering their studies and were
at university level.
University level.
You know, I think there's so many opportunities for fellowships. Rotary is very, very good. And I think for any teacher, whether it's in a college, whether it's a young teacher beginning the teaching career, is just that first opportunity of traveling abroad. Of course, I always say early on, try to learn a second language. But I know oftentimes for some of our Nebraska schools, that's a bit more difficult. But I think that experience of traveling abroad, and not to be hesitant to going after funds to make that possible. Through the companies that within your own town, through philanthropists, through your own church. There's a lot of opportunities to travel internationally, but I think the earlier that we can begin that process with the students, and particularly with the teachers, it can make a huge impact in their own teaching.
I think so too, especially for young teachers. Now, your first experience was through 4-H. And were you a high school student then, or a college
4-H
student?
would be the IFE program is
earlier.
for university graduates.
Okay.
But you have to have been a 4-H'er. So the merit is really because it's part of the international program of the National 4-H Foundation out of Washington, D.C.
Okay, so your 4-H experience
it was a 4-H
young.
experience that led into that. And IFE still exists. There's still Nebraskans that go abroad, and there's a lot of international students that come to Nebraska as part of the IFE program. As I mentioned, Rotary is also very good. UNESCO Study Abroad is a great resource for traveling abroad. And if you can't find the fellowship, then try to find funds in order to go abroad. And there's so many university programs. For instance, Indiana University has a wonderful summer institute for international learning. University of Colorado has a very good program. And we're hoping in Nebraska to establish an international council on education. So that also, we hope, will bring in more the policy, political groups, and also the corporate sector to think more internationally of how they can support the educational process.
I think once the seed is planted, people will take advantage of it.
Sure.
You've had a lot of interesting happenings in your life, and I'm sure you've had a lot of joys in your life.
Yeah.
If you were to look back over these X number of years, what's brought you the most joy?
Well, making a difference and making an impact at community levels. And that's why I loved working in Africa and working in the field. It was always much easier to be in the field and to make that impact rather than in the New York headquarters with the UN. And even though I really enjoyed that UN New York experience because we were working with the private sector, with Ted Turner, and with large amounts of money, the greatest thrill that I had was seeing more kids in school, building more schools, encouraging a government that they should have a policy on orphans. And I always tell this wonderful story in Malawi when UNICEF, and then I served as the representative, had the children's campaign during that electoral process after 34 years. And we had promised all of the 3 candidates running for president that UNICEF would provide a pencil and a notebook if the government, the new government, would have free primary education and no school fees. Up until then, it had been a very traditional English system where they always had school fees and they had school uniforms. So the average family size is 7. The average income was $200 a year. Kids, they can't afford to send their kids to school. So we had insisted with all of them in this policy that had been endorsed by my executive director that if you just do these 2 things, we will ensure that you have a pencil and a notebook for each child. So President Malusi won. He called me 2 days after the election. He said, okay, Natalie, next Tuesday I'm going to announce free primary education, no school fees, no school uniforms. Little did we know that the enrollment would triple. It went from 1.2 million to 3.4 million with that announcement.
Wow.
So you had mothers going to school for the first time, taking their kids to school. So, I made this commitment. I'm going to have to work fast. And luckily, a tobacco company actually came up with the funding to provide, and we had to get international quotes. We finally got all of the supplies coming in from Zimbabwe. And what happened when we recruited Peace Corps, Rotary, university people to distribute these pencils and notebooks throughout the country is that invariably, each time a child got a pencil, they broke it in half to give the other pencil to a younger brother or sister. Because it was the first time They had a pencil. And then they would always, when we'd go out to the schools to hand these out, and we were always hit by mobs because the UNICEF trucks would come in with this huge amount of supplies. And they would always sit on their notebooks because they were so sure that we would take them back after UNICEF left.
Sure.
So things like that. Or on my 50th birthday, I had new dresses made for 500 orphans. You know, such a simple thing. Yet for a child to have a new dress, a child to have the dignity that they could have their own book. When we started work in Malawi, on average, there was one book for 60 children in the school systems. So for a child to take home one book was a major, major event in their life. So this biggest impact in a child and a mother having that first $50 so she could do some project that she decided to do, that she had the independence of using that money, that's the greatest thrill.
Well, that's wonderful. That's a wonderful story, and I think we'll end on that story.
Well,
and I want to say how
Larry.
proud we are to have you as a UNL and college graduate.
Thank you.
And very, very pleased that you're here.
Thank
and
you.
Congratulations
I'm
on your
happy to
award.
be home. This is just the beginning of a lot more exciting events I'm sure we can work on.
I hope so.
You have wonderful faculty. I'm so impressed with the dean and international programs now having such a major part, and I'm just delighted with Malika to work with you.
Good. We're excited.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.